Welcome to the lab orientation on the histology of the skin. Histologically, there are two skin types, thin skin and thick skin. Let's discuss the thick skin first. The thick skin is divided into two layers, the superficial epidermis, as indicated by the blue arrow. Just below the epidermis, lying below the epidermis is the dermis, as indicated by the green arrow. Let's discuss the epidermis first, which is further subdivided into 5 layers, the deepest of which is Stratum Basale. Just above the Stratum Basale is Stratum Spinosum. The dark layer is known as Stratum Granulosum, and the light staining layer is known as Stratum Lucidum, and the most superficial layer is the Stratum Corneum. Let's take a look at Stratum Basale first at higher magnification. The Stratum Basale is composed of single layer of keratinocytes that are attached on the basement membrane. These keratinocytes are capable of mitosis to replenish the cells that are constantly being sloughed off. Also found on the Stratum Basale are the melanin-producing cells known as melanocytes. These are clear cells in the basal layer with dark nuclei. As a matter of fact, melanocytes can only be found in the basal layer. Let's move on to the layer just above the Stratum Basale, and this is the Stratum Spinosum. This layer is called the Stratum Spinosum because of the prominent spines that can be seen on the keratinocytes. These spines are apparent at higher magnification. These spines are actually desmosomes, or intercellular bridges, that are revealed with the shrinkage of the cell during the processing of the slide. Right above the Stratum Spinosum is the dark staining layer known as the Stratum Granulosum. The keratinocytes here are dark staining because they contain keratohyalin granules. The next layer is the Stratum Lucidum. This is a thin translucent zone seen only in thick skin. The keratinocytes are densely packed with a protein called elidin, a precursor for keratin. And finally, the most superficial layer is the Stratum Corneum. This is composed of up to 30 layers of dead, scaly keratinocytes. The surface cells eventually flake off or exfoliate. This layer is prominent in thick skin, which is found on the palm, on the sole, and their corresponding fingers and toes. Next, let's discuss the dermis, located below the epidermis. The dermis is divided into 2 layers. The superficial finger-like projection is known as the papillary dermis, whereas most of the dermis is known as the dermis proper, or the reticular layer. The papillary dermis is composed of loose connective tissue. On the other hand, dermis proper, or reticular layer, is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. On the dermis of the thick skin, you may find sweat glands, which morphologically is a simple coiled tubular gland. Let's review now the layers of the epidermis of the thick skin. The layers are Stratum Basale, Stratum Spinosum, Stratum Granulosum, Stratum Lucidum, and Stratum Corneum. The epidermis of the thick skin is composed of 5 layers, with increased granular layer and thick stratum corneum. They can only be found on the palms of the hand and the soles. They contain more sensory receptors. They lack sebaceous glands, but they do contain increased amount of sweat glands. No hair follicles can be seen on the thick skin. Let's now move on to the thin skin. In contrast to the thick skin, the thin skin contains less than 5 layers in the epidermis. The stratum lucidum is missing. This type of skin is found all over the body except in the palm and the sole. Hair follicles are also present, except in certain areas such as the lips, the labia minora, and the glans penis. So what are the layers found on the epidermis of the thin skin? These are stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, and stratum corneum. Take note that stratum lucidum is missing. Now let's take a look at the dermis of the thin skin. Just like that of the thick skin, the dermis is also divided into 2 layers. The superficial finger-like projection is known as a papillary dermis, which is composed of loose connective tissue, whereas the rest of the dermis is composed of dermis proper, or the reticular layer. This is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. On the dermis of the thin skin, we may also find appendages such as hair follicles and sebaceous gland. Let's focus at the sebaceous gland. A sebaceous gland is actually a compound tubulo-alveolar gland. It is located adjacent to a hair follicle, and together the hair follicle and the sebaceous gland is known as the pilosebaceous unit. Let's summarize what we have discussed so far. There are 2 histologic skin types, namely thin skin and thick skin. The thin skin is found all over the body, except in certain areas where we find the thick skin. The thick skin can only be found in the palm and the sole. The thin skin only contains 4 layers in the epidermis. The stratum lucidum is missing. On the other hand, on the thick skin, we will find the 5 layers. The dermal appendages that can be found on the thin skin includes sweat glands, sebaceous glands, and hair follicles, whereas on the thick skin, only sweat glands can be found. Thank you, and thank you for listening.